Hello and welcome to Within the Frame. I'm Handan in Seoul. The UN Women's Center of Excellence for Gender Equality has hosted its second round of Seoul Dialogue, aiming to promote a workplace culture that supports work-life balance. The UN organization was established in 2022 with support from the South Korean government, focusing on gender equality and the empowerment of women. Among the participants was Gary Ford, co-founder of Men for Inclusion, who has been a leading advocate for practical and targeted efforts to advance diversity, equity, and inclusion. We are now honored to welcome Mr. Ford to the studio. Thank you so much for coming in today.
Thank you for inviting me.
So you've been invited by the UN Women's Center of Excellence for Gender Equality for the second straight year. Let's begin by discussing the purpose of your visit to South Korea.
Sure. So I think maybe to start with, we'll talk about the context of maybe last year's conference, which was the first one having been established in 2022 that UN Women had run. And I think one of the keys for last year was a focus on particular industries, and particularly the private sector. So I think UN Women have recognised that the private sector are probably quite key to driving forward sustainable development goals, particularly number 5, so gender equality. And last year was very targeted on sectors that struggle to attract and retain women, so finance, technology, infrastructure. And as someone who has largely worked in finance and technology, I think it was really key that a major part of the dialogue was this idea of male allyship and engaging men on this subject and getting them more involved in the conversation. So I think last year was very much about awareness and perhaps the role that men can play. This year we wanted to go a little bit deeper, and the conversation was more about more practical action, and particularly exploring this idea of inclusive leadership and how actually, if we were to solve some of the very pressing, challenging, complex business problem, actually inclusive leadership is one of the key things that we need to start doing.
And we will definitely talk more about inclusive leadership as we move on. But before that, you've co-founded an organization called Men for Inclusion. Yep. It's not women for inclusion, but men for inclusion. And there's a reason for that, right? Tell us more about it. What is its primary objective?
Yeah, I mean, it's coming from the place where myself and my main business partner, we're both men, we're both of a certain age, we're both of a certain demographic, a certain ethnicity. And actually, unfortunately, certainly in the UK, most of the senior leaders kind of look a bit like us, as you can imagine. So our primary goal is to kind of work with mostly executive teams, actually both men and women. Most of the work we do is with mixed gender groups, and really help them develop their inclusive leadership skills. And we've worked now with probably 60 or 70 different organizations, mostly in the financial services sector, but not just within that. And it really is just an ongoing kind of set of conversations. We do a little bit of research, but it's usually getting men women in a room and understanding how we are creating inequitable outcomes and inequitable opportunities. So therefore, what are the practical things we can begin to do about that? And one of our keys is this has to be men and women together. Men can't solve this problem on their own, right? And I don't think women can either. So it needs to be both genders, and there are clearly multiple other genders, but both genders trying to drive a conversation forward.
So you mostly work with executive teams consisting of both men and women to help them improve their inclusive leadership skills.
Yes.
It's no easy task, though, isn't it? I mean, trying to induce a change in deep-rooted, centuries-old beliefs surrounding gender and race and their capabilities. So what you're doing is truly inspiring. Now, you took several leading roles as a director at JPMorgan. Needless to say, it's a top global financial services firm.
For sure.
What motivated you to make a shift in your path and become a passionate advocate for diversity, equity, and inclusion?
Yeah, I mean, I have to confess, I almost started doing it by accident. I was asked to sponsor our gender network for women in IT. And through that, I started attending a lot of female-led events and began to hear about some of the additional barriers that women were facing in their technology careers. And I think initially, I think I was motivated with a sense of fair play. It didn't feel right to me. But secondly, a realization that I was probably part of the problem, because the things they were explaining to me were not things that I had particularly noticed. So I kind of realized that maybe I was part of the problem too. I didn't like that idea. And I wanted to be better at leading teams. So we started kind of thinking about this idea of male allyship. We started creating a greater awareness of these challenges within our male leadership community. But more importantly, we started asking them, what can we do about this? And I began to realize, interestingly enough, that this conversation was actually helping me get better as a leader. I often say this, I'm not a natural empath. So I began to realize that actually this is something I had to work at. Being inclusive doesn't come naturally to me, so it's almost like a muscle you have to exercise every single day. So after a little while, it was about, this is helping me become a better leader, actually a better friend, a better husband, and a better father. I mean, certainly the fact that I have 2 daughters probably had some influence. But we started talking to other companies about this beyond JPMorgan and began to realize that actually every company has these type of challenges. And JPMorgan is a great company. I wouldn't want anyone to think that they were doing something badly wrong. They were doing lots of great things. But it is, to your point, this is centuries of very gendered thinking that we're trying to undo. So I realized others had an interest, and I thought, this is something I can help others with. I mean, I spent so many hours. I've spoken to thousands of men and women on this subject. So I just thought, this is something I can help others to learn with. And we're all still learning.
Right.
I don't know it all at all, right?
And you've also previously mentioned that we don't have a choice but to start acting now because of the demographic challenges,
Absolutely.
the demographics of future workforce. South Korea is actually one of the countries that is facing a dire demographic crisis as well.
That's right.
Now, global awareness of gender equality has significantly improved, and yet the number of female leaders, especially in key industries such as the IT and the finance sector, they still remain much lower than their male counterparts. What do you think are still contributing to this disparity?
Yeah, I mean, it's a multifactored problem, as I'm sure you know. I mean, one of the things that there's some stuff we do with girls and boys at a very young age that tends to steer boys towards, science and technology, and still tends to steer women towards humanities. So I still think that plays out. I mean, there's lots of great initiatives trying to combat that, but it's still a major problem. I also think that undeniably, women have to do more of the unpaid work at home, and that tends to be hugely exacerbated when they have a young family. And that affects all industries, clearly. So that factor is still very clear. But for me, the major thing, I think, is the culture in which we have within very male-dominated industries. And it's not necessarily that people are deliberately trying to create a culture that's alienating for women, but because of our deep gendered biases, women are finding that it's harder to be heard in the companies. When they are heard, their ideas are not valued. We steer them towards highly administrative tasks rather than real career-enhancing tasks. So there's a number of things that make maybe the corporate life in a very male-dominated culture, women always get this subliminal message that you're not valued, you're not welcomed here. So it's not surprising that sometimes they take the choice to maybe drop away from that. So there's lots more we can do, but I think how we take a look at what's the culture of organization, I think that's the biggest thing for me.
So the decline in female representation as you move up the ladder, especially in fierce key industries that we've just talked about, like the IT and the finance sector, it's a global phenomenon, isn't it? And the billion-dollar question is, what pragmatic efforts can companies make to address this issue? Now, based on your experience as a leader leading many teams at a giant financial firm, what's your suggestion?
I mean, it is hard yards, if I'm honest, but it does come back to culture. And I think I certainly think leaders have a responsibility for defining the culture that they want to work in. And actually, this is not something that can come top down. I think this is a conversation that you actually need to encourage everyone to be part of. And one of the things that really comes out of our work, as I mentioned, is additional barriers for women. But the point being that those additional barriers are about how careers are developed. And it is largely kind of accidental, and we'll talk about the book in a second. But once people begin to realize that we are creating these barriers, and obviously that takes an amount of awareness and conversation, two things begin to emerge. Firstly, that actually these barriers also do affect men, just not as much. And secondly, when you kind of begin to tell people that the world or their workplace is not meritocratic, actually most people kind of are rooted in this sense of fair play and want to take action. So I think one of the most important things we can do is get men and women in a room and have some very difficult conversations about, so what is the culture that we want to create? And then start saying, well, what's preventing us from finding that culture? And from then I think it's like, well, so how can we find good solutions? And then the second thing I think is we do have to use data within these conversations, particularly in places like technology and finance, which are very driven by data. We've got to show the data that shows this different experience that men and women might have, but also data that becomes very targeted as when it happens. Is it due to the way in which people are promoted? Are we losing women at a certain level? Are we losing women when they do take breaks for childcare? I think you have to get quite forensic. And then you can do some really targeted interventions, whether that's sponsorship programs, whether that's demystifying promotion processes. I mean, it sounds simple stuff, but I think once you've got a data-led approach, then I think then people begin to see real progress. And actually, there's some logic behind what you're trying to do. There seems to be a lot of initiatives that know they need to do something, but it's all a little bit scattergun. One of the things I advocate is you've got to see this as a change program. And your change programs have a certain structure that you need to put in place.
You've delivered a keynote speech at this year's Seoul Dialogue hosted by the UN Women's Center, emphasizing the role of inclusive leadership. Of course, inclusive leadership, we can imagine, is crucial in advancing gender equality and diversity. But you also stressed the need to differentiate allyship and the being an inclusion leader. Can you elaborate on this?
Yeah, and first off, I'd like to say I think there are some people who've done an amazing job being great allies, whether it's for women or actually for people from other typically underrepresented groups. I don't want to downplay the role of allies. I think it's been very important. I was an ally at JPMorgan with the Male Allies program. But more recently, I began to get a little bit concerned that allyship can only take us so far. And I do think there's a limited number of men, unfortunately, that will sign up for a kind of allyship approach. And I do worry that allyship for some men, not all men, some men means simply sort of coaching, sponsoring, mentoring, training, supporting women, but only on how to succeed in the current culture. In other words, we're potentially just coaching those women to lead like men. It's interesting when I run mixed gender workshops. It's quite not uncommon that the women in those workshops will say to me, "I much prefer working for a male manager than a female manager." Right? And it's kind of like, have we created women managers actually who just act like men, and that's not necessarily their natural style. And I think what inclusion leaders do, because I think it's one step further, I think their role is to sponsor, coach, mentor, train men and women on how to succeed in an inclusive culture. And I do think that's leadership's job. And actually, that is about everyone. It's not just about the women. That's about coaching your men too. So to give you an example, one of the challenges that women typically find in most corporate cultures is just simply they are not heard. Right? An ally might coach that woman to speak up more in meetings. An inclusion leader just changes the way the meetings run so that everyone has a voice from the outset. So I think it's just a subtle change in emphasis, but also I think it's also putting the mirror on yourself and say, am I inclusive? Do the people that work for me believe I'm inclusive? Am I trying to change the culture? Yeah.
There are also concerns about reverse discrimination against men as more companies promote gender equality. What's your perspective on this?
Yeah, I think there is a danger that we can overbalance, actually, and I think I'm certainly not an advocate of any sort of discriminatory practices, even if I could say it. So I do think these things do cut both ways, and actually no one wants to be promoted or hired simply because of their gender. That's not fair to people either, right? You're kind of setting people up to fail almost. So I do think we need to, if people feel that they've seen examples of reverse discrimination, I think it opens up a conversation. Now, clearly from the data you mentioned earlier, it's clearly not systemic. The numbers will show you, right? Like the number of women in senior leadership is not progressing at a super fast rate. So the data's not supporting it. So it's not systematic. It's not happening at a macro level. But that's not to say there's not an individual example that someone can point to. And I think, again, if someone feels that this is happening, then I think that's an opportunity for a conversation. We can use some data to help with that conversation. But also we can open up a conversation that says, okay, so what are your barriers for the type of career you want? And I don't know, there could be this sense that, maybe there's extra training that's needed that maybe companies are focused on doing for women. Maybe there's opportunities for men to take part in that. We did something at JPMorgan that I really liked. We did a program that was very targeted for women about developing confidence in kind of big group situations, right? And they'd given a big presentation or kind of chairing a meeting or whatever. And we ran a couple of cohorts of this program, and the women were absolutely ecstatic about it. They loved it. It was working really, really well. And then quite a few of the guys were saying, actually, I'd quite like to develop those skills too. So the next cohort of the program we run, it was still mostly women. We started allowing a few men to come along to that, if that was something they felt was a problem in their careers. So I think it's still about trying to find solutions that can help both people. And if people feel there's reverse discrimination, let's have a conversation about that.
Now, Amazon's best-selling book, The Accidental Sexist, that you brought today, you have co-authored the book, and it has earned wide acclaim. Now, for our viewers who may not have had the chance to read it, what is the key message of the book? And also, have you witnessed some positive changes since its release? Yeah,
I think the book's really about three things. This idea of accidental sexism originally came from some research that one of my co-authors did, Dr. Jill Armstrong, 3-year research program at Cambridge University. And she found these extra barriers that affected women in their careers. And we decided to call them accidental sexism because, they're not unlike unconscious bias, but we kind of felt the rephrasing of it gave people an opportunity to just take the conversation in a different way and recognize the fact that this is not necessarily anybody's fault. We all make these accidental mistakes, and therefore, when we realize that we're making accidental mistakes, number one, we're kind of recognizing that people mostly have good intent. I think most people in work are trying to do the right thing. But secondly, we can actually learn from that, right? We can use that as an opportunity to learn when we slightly get it wrong. And clearly, these are not the big egregious things. We're not talking about harassment and bullying and very misogynistic things. We're talking about very small daily things, a couple I've already mentioned. So that's the first point. It's just creating that awareness that these things are happening, and they're happening more to women than men. The second part of it is how you think about beginning to engage men on this subject. So my other co-author, Stephen Kosh, another managing director in technology at JPMorgan, that part of the book is really about our efforts to engage men. And if I'm honest, we got quite a lot of it wrong. But we kind of learned from that. So we kind of learned how to get better at having those conversations, some of them very difficult, and hopefully sharing with people what works and what we think doesn't work so well. And then finally, we just amassed a just whole range of kind of practical ideas about what we could do about it. And actually, some of them are quite basic, I think, leadership and managerial skills, but literally practical things that we think people could put into play. And you don't have to be a leader, or you don't have to have the title leader on your name badge. I think we can all be kind of leaders in inclusion. It's one of the interesting things about diversity and inclusion. It's very hard for us to change diversity every single day. We're not hiring every day, we're not promoting every day, but we can all be inclusive every day, right? So it's something we can all practice. So that was the key thing. Has it generated change? I'm not sure what I could put down to the book, if I'm honest. I mean, if it's helped in some small way, that's fantastic. But I do think I am seeing most companies now are trying to have a strategy to engage men around this conversation. So I think that's very positive. When I started 10 years ago, there wasn't a lot of that. We couldn't find many other companies doing it. So I do think a lot of companies do it. A lot of those are focused on allyship. That's a good start. I think the more mature companies are beginning to pivot more towards inclusion. So kind of moving the conversation we just had onto that inclusive leadership. No one country's got this absolutely fixed. So I think companies are still learning. But I think at a macro level, and there are some pushbacks, and I think we're going to talk about those in a second. There are some pushbacks, but I think the macro level, I think we are seeing progress. I think there's still the role of government and policy that's still maturing. Interestingly, I think in financial services, I think there's a role for the regulator, and we're seeing that, certainly in the UK. So I still think there's quite a long way to go, but I think in the whole, it's not a straight line. I think progress is improving. We're still going backwards from time to time, if the book's helping. I mean, and I should mention actually, the book is being translated into Korean. We're hoping to release a version of it in January, February time for a great company based here, Merry Young Social Club. So hopefully that can help a bit more here too.
Now, I did want to ask you about worsening gender conflict here in Korea, but because we are running short on time, let me skip to the last question before we let you go.
Sure.
What are your thoughts on Korea's dwindling birth rate? It's the lowest in the world. What strategies does the country need to help Korean women achieve the work-life balance?
Yeah, so it's such a thorny issue, and actually Korea is not the only country that has this challenge. But also, I think for organisations, they have to find a way to attract women into the workplace. Right? This is no longer optional for them; it's kind of completely mandatory. So they have to find strategies for doing that, and also to just slightly change the perspective. I think this is not just a problem for women. I think it's a problem for men too. So we know that one of the things that will certainly help women is a lot more flexibility, a lot more support during those years. From the minute they start planning a family through to the minute they're ready to return to work if that's what they want to do. But increasingly, I think these things are more important, just as important to men, right? More and more younger men want to play a more active role in the younger years of their childhood. So I think this flexibility is also something that men are seeking. And I think also as men get better and have more kind of access to childcare at home, I think naturally that will lead to men doing more of the unpaid work at home, which also I think is a really good thing. So I think the strategy we need to deploy is a strategy that actually supports both men and women with those difficult years. We also have to recognise that for those people that cannot have children or choose not to have children, we've also got to give them some flexibility too. So I do think the approaches have got to be multi-gendered. They've got to work for everyone. And actually, I think it's one of the keys to getting this stuff right. And I think if Korea can do that, there was a great example at the UN conference yesterday. You may have heard of it, Lotte. They've made parental leave mandatory for men in their organization. Right. And that's brilliant. Right.
We are beginning to take some fresh initiatives like that, yeah.
And I think that's such a great example. And they are absolutely raving about what a great impact that's had and how popular it is, and how men aren't feeling that they can't take paternity leave because their careers will suffer. That's a great example, I think.
All right, well, we hope we can incorporate those strategies so more Korean women can find their much needed work-life balance. Thank you so much, Mr. Ford, for coming in today and for the meaningful and timely discussion on the pressing issue. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Tayo.
And that brings us to the end of the show. Thank you for watching, and we'll be back with more same time next week. Have a great weekend.